CNBC TV18 Investment Guide. This is TV18 and you're watching CNBC TV18.
As climate change takes center stage in global policy making, the transition to clean energy is no longer a pipe dream. It is an urgent need. In the recently contested U.S. elections, battling climate change is one of the key agendas of the Biden campaign. As part of his presidential transition, Joe Biden has named former Secretary of State John Kerry as the next U.S. climate envoy. Kerry was one of the leading architects of the Paris Accord, which Joe Biden has pledged to get the U.S. back into. In fact, global investments in clean energy assets touched $300 billion in 2019. And in India, the Prime Minister set a target for growth of renewable energy from the current installed capacity of 90 gigawatts to 450 gigawatts by 2030. In his book, Fossil Free, the CEO of ReNew Power, Sumant Sinha presents a compelling case for the world to reduce its carbon footprint. He also draws out the blueprint required to make India a leader in the new energy transition and the challenges and opportunities that lie therein. In fact, I'm joined by Sumant Sinha to talk more about the road ahead. Also joining me this evening, Lord Turner, Chairman of the Energy Transitions Commission and Senior Fellow at the Institute of New Economic Thinking. We also have with us Aruna Bhagosh, the CEO for the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us. We'll shortly be joined by the Power Secretary, I hope. Sumant, congratulations on Fossil Free, the book that you've decided to author. And, you know, as I pointed out at the start of the program, we have made significant strides in our effort to move towards renewable energy. In fact, let me just give our viewers the India report card. Solar capacity is up from approximately 2.6 gigawatts to over 34 gigawatts in the last 5.5 years. Renewable energy installed capacity has increased over 200% in the last 5 years. The largest clean energy expansion program of 175 gigawatts till 2022. So a lot of effort, a lot of momentum has been built in the last few years, Sumant Sinha. What's the playbook for the future, more importantly, given the opportunities and the challenges that exist?
Yeah, thank you, Shereen, and thank you so much for hosting this conversation about fossil free. Look, it's a very pertinent topic right now, especially in the context of the issues around climate change, with, as you mentioned, the Biden administration coming in. Hopefully that whole conversation at a multilateral level now reaches a different point where the U.S. is now a driver of those conversations rather than, trying to get out of those conversations. So hopefully that will result in a much stronger movement globally. Now, as far as India is concerned, the Prime Minister has taken the lead on setting these very ambitious targets on setting up renewable energy capacity. But as you know, that's only one of the issues that we have to look at, albeit a very important one. In addition to that, we also have to look at the actual deepening of electrification that needs to happen in parallel, so that within the energy ambit, as it were, more things move towards electricity, and then that over time we green that electricity more and more through renewable energy. And both of those, in some ways, both of those interdependent but parallel transitions are happening right now. And in doing that, the Indian government, as I said, is playing a very important role. Of course, a lot more needs to be done, especially in the area of reforming the power sector, ease of doing business at the ground level, for us to get into manufacturing and so on. So there's a lot of things that we have to work on. But I'm fairly optimistic that the future is bright in this area, and the government certainly is working in that direction.
Okay, I'll come to what the government needs to focus on and some of the stumbling blocks in order for us to be able to achieve those ambitious targets that you spoke of. But let me get Lord Turner into the conversation. Lord Turner, the good news, I guess, from a climate change perspective is that the Biden administration is promising to be back with the Paris Accord and to take the climate change agenda forward. But from an investment point of view, and especially for capital and fiscal constrained governments at this point in time, to make the transition to clean energy, to green energy, where is the funding going to come from? One of the important developments that we've seen, especially in 2020, is the momentum that ESG funds have started to garner and the kind of money that is coming through via ESG funds. Is that going to be one of the big tipping points?
Well, I think that will play a role, but a lot of the investment funds will come from people simply trying to make a good return on the renewable technologies, which are increasingly going to be the cheapest way of producing electricity. Sumant has talked about the huge importance of doing two things simultaneously: electrifying more of our economies and decarbonizing our electricity. In the Energy Transition Commission, we believe that across the world, we've got to see an increase in total global electricity production of about 3 or 4 times by 2050, taking it from 27,000 terawatt hours today to order of magnitude 90,000 terawatt hours by 2050. That will require very significant amounts of investments of maybe 1 to 1.5% of global GDP going into the generation capacity, the transmission capacity, the distribution capacity that we need. But that is absolutely doable. Remember, the world, saves and invests about 25% of GDP at the moment. This is not a massive shift, and it's going to be into a new technology, which is the competitive technology for the future. So a lot of the flows will happen automatically. Where I think there is a challenge sometimes is in some of the developing economies where the cost of capital is higher than it is in the developed.
Yes.
If I looked at the cost of capital to develop, for instance, offshore wind in the North Sea off the coast of Britain, as long as the contracts are well defined, there will be lots and lots of pension funds and insurance companies queuing up to invest in that as a good infrastructure project. I think when you get to India, and I know that Sumant has talked about this in the past, the cost of capital is significantly higher. And that is often because there are risks, there's a lack of clarity, there's sometimes delays in getting projects going. And a lot of those details of how you make it easy to do business and how have absolute legal certainty of contract are crucial to getting down the cost of capital and unleashing the big financial flows, not just from ESG funds, but from people who just want a good, reasonable rate of return on this technology of the future.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, though, for those who are looking at a good, reasonable rate of return, some of the issues that you highlighted, which is predictability and certainty of legal contracts, as well as the cost of capital, will, of course, be things to focus on. But I'll come back to what the imperatives need to be from a policy perspective, the carrot and stick approach that we're seeing play out across the world in just a second. But let me get Arunabha into the conversation. Arunabha, let's talk about some of the challenges now for India to be able to meet some of those targets. The concerns on bank funding for renewables, something that Lord Turner was talking about, payment delays, given the state of play as far as DISCOMs are concerned, that continues to be one of the significant challenges. There is now an uncertainty and a lack of clarity on what the policies are likely to be when it comes to import duties and so on and so forth, in light of the fact that the government is moving towards production-linked incentive schemes for solar. What does the regulatory landscape look like, and how challenging is that from an investor perspective today?
Shereen, thanks for having me on the show. The regulatory landscape, in one word, looks muddled. It looks muddled because on one hand, there is a clear intention on behalf of the government, followed up with action in terms of continuing to do a lot of tenders. Even at the peak of the pandemic, India has gone ahead and sanctioned 12,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity, even as thermal power assets were lying idle. So that demonstrates that there is some seriousness behind the targets. However, that whole story gets muddled up because the sanctity of the contracts, the periodicity with which the power purchase agreements could be signed, the access to land, etc., those again remain uncertain for many developers. And then, even with developers who have proven their mettle on the ground, such as Sumant, you have institutional investors who need to come in. India is right now averaging about $10 to $11 billion a year of investment into renewables, when we need upwards of $30 billion a year. When you combine it with electric vehicles, with energy efficiency, with a move towards more low carbon technologies for our heavy industries, we're talking about a lot more money and especially institutional capital that needs to come in. Now, unless we solve the legacy issues of our power sector, this overhang will remain. In the interim, just responding to what Lord Turner was saying, the state can still do things for de-risking the existing contracts or the upcoming contracts and reducing that cost of capital. If that cost of capital were not 60% or 70% of the tariff, but maybe 40-45% of the tariff, we can have significantly lower tariffs for renewables. But the long-term solution is still to deal with the past overhang of the power system and the way our electricity system is governed.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That overhang continues to overshadow the present as well. Sumant Sinha, we're hoping that these legacy issues will be addressed and will be addressed as quickly as possible. But given the reality of the current situation, how do you see us moving ahead and forging a path forward into a renewable future? I'll ask you this in the context of electrification and the move towards electric mobility, for instance. We had this big tender with a lot of fanfare being put out by the EESL saying that they're going to pick up 10,000 cars. And at the end of, 3 years since that tender, 2017, if my memory serves me right, only 1,500 electric cars have been procured as part of that tender process. So to the point that Arunabha was making about a muddled regulatory environment where intent is strong and good, but the execution falls short of the intention.
Yeah, look, Shereen, just to talk a little bit about electric vehicles, I don't know whether you've seen what the UK has announced, which is that post 2030, all vehicles sold should be electric in nature. I think India needs to do something transformational along those lines as well. Maybe not 100% post 2030, but let's say 30% or 50%, whatever be that number. And they need to think through it based on the existing manufacturing systems, the time it will take for the existing manufacturers to convert into manufacturing electric vehicles, the development, what happens to the ICE components industry, how does that retool itself, and also the development of batteries, because that's an important part of the whole equation. I think, therefore, the government needs to really do deep work in that and then fundamentally come out with an announcement, just like they've come out in renewable energy, where they've said, path-breaking 450 gigawatts by 2030, a similar announcement to be made for electric vehicles post-2030, and not just for passenger vehicles, but also for public transportation, for 2- and 3-wheelers, and so on. And so we look at the entire mobility area and start moving that into the electric side. I think that is very critical. I think in addition to that, as far as the renewable energy side is concerned, you talked about the fact that, and Arunabha talked about the fact that we do need to reform the power sector, because ultimately we are operating within that sector, and so that whole sector does need to be reformed. And within that, if we can improve the quality of the PPAs that we sign, which the government has done substantially by interposing SECI as the off-taker, then certainly it will allow us to bring down the cost of capital and therefore the tariffs in turn. And that will then again speed up the adoption of renewable energy. But I think in parallel to that, and to hasten the process, the government also needs to really start enforcing the renewable purchase obligation targets as well, because that ultimately will, coalesce DISCOM's minds around having to buy more renewable energy, rather than for SECI to just carry on doing auctions and then for people not to buy that power from them. So I think we need to then just make sure that the whole pipeline from bidding all the way till installation and the purchase of power by the DISCOMs, that whole pipeline continues. Because if that doesn't happen, then the target of 450 gigawatts and even the interim target of 175 by 2022 starts looking difficult. And we need to actually give a very significant line of sight to investors, because as was mentioned earlier by Arunabha, today we're investing $10 to $12 billion. We need to do $30 to $40 billion. That capital has to come from somewhere. A lot of it has to be equity, some obviously large part of it has to be debt as well. But that capital will only come in if that capital gets reasonable rates of return. There is a predictable long-term regulatory environment that gives people comfort and therefore de-risk the entire system. So I think those are the kinds of interventions that we require to have from the government. They've done a lot of it, but some of the crucial pieces are still need to be addressed.
You know, Lord Turner, let's pick up on the piece that Sumant spoke of, and that is the move towards electric mobility. And as Sumant pointed out, the UK has now advanced the move away from IC engines to electric mobility from 2040 to 2030. But in a country like India, where affordability and accessibility is crucial and public transportation is barely available or accessible, can the government actually put down a timeline of, say, by 2030 we'll do away with all IC engines, etc.? I mean, look at the cost of batteries. Yes, it has come down significantly, but it's still out of reach and out of pocket for a large majority of this country. So what role can the government then play to de-risk? And are subsidies really the way forward? Because every government finds itself cash-strapped today.
Well, if you look at what's happening to the cost of batteries, they are continuing to fall. They've come down about 85% in the last 9 or 10 years. And I think they'll come down by another 50 to maybe 70% in the next 10 years. And most people who look at it believe that there will be a point somewhere in the mid-2020s where the cost of buying an electric car up front will be cheaper than buying an internal combustion engine. We will also see steady progress in terms of the ranges. We're going to see more and more cars coming onto the market with ranges of, say, 300, 400, 500 kilometers.
Yeah.
And once you start getting the electric car being cheaper to buy up front as well as cheaper to sell, I think we could see a much more rapid takeoff of electric vehicle purchase, even in low to middle income countries such as India, than our current forecasts suggest. And I think the crucial thing for the government to look at is what will the barriers that get in the way of that inevitable process of a move to a better, cheaper system. One of the crucial ones is charging infrastructure. That, I think, is a crucial area for the government to focus on, but also, as Sumant says, to make sure that for India, it is actually having a significant amount of the industry which supports this, the electrical vehicle manufacturers and the battery manufacturers occurring in India. Yeah. But what I would say is that I think India, like the UK, like other countries, needs to have a clear strategy, because otherwise it won't be serving the interests of its automotive industry. It will be actually going against it. The last thing you want for an automotive industry is to sit there believing that they're still going to be producing just internal combustion engines in 2030 and finding that they've been made completely uncompetitive by this new technology. So I think we are on the verge of a revolution here. One final thing, I think what India could do is really drive the electrification of the 2- and 3-wheeler area, which, by the way, has huge and very rapid payoff in terms of local air pollution. 2- and 3-wheelers are often some of the far worse than 4-wheeler internal combustion engine cars in terms of the quality of the engine, and driving that forward, which is easier from a charging infrastructure point of view because the batteries are sometimes light enough to take out and charge in a home even if you can't park right next to it. So I think India needs a very strong strategy for rapid progress on the 2- and 3-wheeler space. But I would agree with Sumant. I think it should be setting a clear quantitative target of where it will be by 2030 and when it will get to a complete ban on internal combustion engines. And the bet that the UK government has taken is that by making that 2030 commitment, that is in the long-term interest of our automotive industry, because it's forcing them to pivot round to what is undoubtedly going to be the technology of the future. Within 10 years' time, people will be buying electric cars for less than the cost of an internal combustion engine. They will be saving money on their family budgets, and we need to make sure that that's an easy thing for them to do.
Oh, that will be the big tipping point as far as the EV revolution is concerned. If the upfront cost of an electric car or an electric vehicle is less than that of an IC engine, of course, the total cost of ownership does come down significantly. But let me get the Power Secretary into the conversation. Mr. Sahai, many thanks for joining us here on the program. Conversations here with Sumant Sinha, Lord Turner and Arunabha Ghosh. And I think one of the big challenges that the industry continues to face is the lack of predictability when it comes to contractual obligations. In Arunabha Ghosh's words, there is a muddled regulatory environment. What can we now expect in being able to deal with some of the legacy issues? Also, if you can give us more clarity on, for instance, as Sumant was talking about, the renewable energy purchase obligations, enforcing those more effectively, and a new energy policy, the contours of which we haven't seen yet.
That's several questions together. Contracts. I mean, the Union Power Ministry, we've been reiterating that contracts are inviolate. You cannot violate the contract. And while there is the contract law, the amendments to the Electricity Act, which we posted for public consultation, talked of a contracts enforcement authority. There may be some changes to that so that it was difficult to draw a hard line between the contract enforcement authority and the regulatory commissions, but that has been resolved, and hopefully as and when the legislation is approved, there will be specifically for the power sector a body with the regulator or outside, a little premature to say now, for enforcement of contracts. Contracts are the substratum on which all the business will be done. So we're very clear that contracts have to be enforced. And we did bring in a lot of several measures to ensure that they are, one notably being the letter of credit mechanism. So we're trying to push. There have been some states which try to renege on those contracts. It's sub judice now. But I think by and large, most states are following the contract. The other question was, can you please repeat it?
On the renewable energy purchase obligation being enforced more effectively.
So that's been put in the tariff policy, and the Supreme Court, Honorable Supreme Court, have ruled that tariff policy has the force of law. But again, to make it clear, it is being put in the draft legislation. So there will be stiff penalties for RPOs not being followed. However, as a policy, we think we should create adequate incentives that propel the states and DISCOMs to move towards renewable energy. So a new policy is being worked at, and I think we will be having consultation with our stakeholders such as ReNew Power, etc., on this new system. So Sumant will have his voice.
Okay. Any timeline, sir, by when you expect the Electricity Act to be cleared to go through?
Okay, so the discussions are over. It's now post-discussions. We have taken people's advice and views on board, and the process of drafting is on. I should think that the draft will be ready in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay, the draft should be ready in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So perhaps will be taken up in the budget session of Parliament?
Yes, if we get a go-ahead from the Cabinet, definitely.
Okay. Okay. A quick follow-up question, because that I think is one of the anticipated policy decisions or schemes from the government. The PLI scheme for battery manufacturing as well as for solar. We've heard from the government as part of that umbrella announcement. What's the road ahead, possible timelines that you can share for us? When can we expect the details on the PLI schemes?
We don't deal with that. It's the Ministry of MNRE which new and renewable energy sources, which deals with it.
I would imagine that there's interministerial consultation on.
No, that's true, but ministry looks at the regulatory part, but not the development part of M&I. So I may not be able to give with certainty the details of this or the timelines. My apologies.
Okay. Arunabha, you've been waiting to... No worries. I appreciate that. Yes, Arunabha, go ahead.
Shereen, I just wanted to comment on a couple of the issues that have come up. If you just connect this issue of the PLI along with what Lord Turner was saying earlier. Look, India overall has to ask itself a very simple question. Are we going to be manufacturing cars, say, in 2030, 2035? Answer would be yes. Are those cars likely to be internal combustion engine cars? Very unlikely. Are we going to be exporting internal combustion engine cars to anywhere else in the world in 2035? Certain no. So the question is not whether I choose to get onto a different trajectory in 2025. The question is the sooner I act towards shaping my future, the sooner I can predict that future. Secondly, the same applies to what kind of domestic production we want to have. And this is where both the size of the Indian market and the nature of the Indian consumer becomes important. Actually, Indian electric vehicles can become cheaper because we don't travel 500 kilometers. We are not Americans. CEW has done a survey of the entire urban mobility sector. The average Indian, if he is using motorized transport, is traveling 5 to 6 kilometers. Not 50 kilometers, not 500 kilometers. Immediately your battery pack becomes smaller. Immediately the cost of the car becomes smaller. Public transport is missing. We want to kickstart domestic production, make electric public buses, make electric two-wheelers, right? These are all create a circular economy of critical minerals. These are all new jobs. If we produce 30% electric vehicles in 2030, we'll be saving more than 1.1 lakh crore in oil imports. So that's $15 billion. So we have to make these strategic choices now, and then the respective line ministries can decide, how to implement those strategic choices.
Yes, and I'm hoping that there will be more alignment between various government departments and ministries. Let me get wrap-up comments from each of you. And Mr. Sahai, speaking of strategic choices, we're likely to see perhaps more announcements coming in from the government as part of the third Renewable Energy Summit. What are the top 3 priorities that the government is focusing on from here on?
The roadmap is clear that we need more renewable energy. The policies are geared to greater generation of renewable energy, manufacturing of components in India, and electrification of mobility as well as cooking and distributed generation. So these are the focus areas.
Well, those are the focus areas, and hopefully the execution roadmap will be aligned with the intention as well. Lord Turner, from a global perspective, the key priorities that you believe, the developing world as well as the developed world need to work towards?
Well, look, we believe that, broadly speaking, the whole of the rich developed world should be committed to be zero carbon by 2050. And that's where the EU now is. That's where Biden's America will now be. We would like the whole of the developing world to now start buying off on a target of being zero carbon by 2060. We think that's a reasonable target. China has just accepted it. We would say that is the target for a country like India. But actually, the really important stuff is not so much that target. It's what happens in the next 10 to 15 years, and in particular in the power sector. And to me, one of the most important targets now to set is that all new growth of electricity, all expansion of the electricity system must now come from zero carbon sources. One can work out later what we do about the coal that already exists. You don't need to close that down immediately. That will be a challenge for the 2030s and the 40s. But if one can just get the principle that we're going to electrify as much of the economy as possible, and that all the wedge, the new growth of electricity demand should be met with zero carbon sources. I think that should be the guiding principle for developing economies today.
Well, let me give the final word to the author, Sumant Sinha. The biggest opportunity that you foresee for India going ahead?
Well, for all the things that Mr. Sahai mentioned and that Lord Turner mentioned, the reality is that India is a massive country. And therefore, all the opportunities that the Power Secretary talked about, if you convert those into investment opportunities in dollars and cents or rupees and crores, they're going to be immense opportunities. And I think if you look at the electrification of the power sector, and we are going to be doing much more of that as we go forward from a greening standpoint, I think you'll see that the investment opportunity just in that area is going to be at least $500 billion over the next 10 years. And it's going to be significantly more than that in the years and the decades after that as well. And so therefore, this is an area that is going to require a tremendous amount of effort, is going to draw in a huge amount of capital, and is going to lead to the creation of companies of scale and size. Countries like India, which are now moving very rapidly into this direction, are going to be leaders and actually have the opportunity of becoming real leaders in the sector. And that is the energy transition that we're in the middle of. And it's a unique opportunity for India to take advantage of that, of this whole energy transition that is playing out globally.
Well, the opportunities are clear, but the challenges need to be dealt with and addressed as well. Consistency of policy, that of course is one of the chief asks of industry. Sumant Sinha, Lord Turner, Arunabha Ghosh and Mr. Sahai, many thanks for joining us here on this special edition of Restarting India. Appreciate your time and your insights. We'll take a quick break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment.